Have you ever looked around your home and felt overwhelmed, not from the mess, but from the feeling that you're the only one who sees it? For many women, especially in this season of life, the weight of an untidy space isn't just about clutter, it's about loneliness, exhaustion, and the deep longing for peace. But here's a quiet truth: organized women aren't chasing perfection. They simply return to 5 gentle habits that bring beauty, ease, and a sense of control. In this video, you'll discover simple cleaning rhythms that not only lighten your home but also lift your spirit. Which one will speak to your heart today? Let's begin. Somewhere between the quiet hush of early light and the soft creak of bedroom floorboards, a choice is made, one that shapes the whole day. Margaret, now 72, makes that choice each morning without fail. Before the kettle hums or the porch light dims, before anyone needs her or the phone rings, she smooths her bed. It's not dramatic, it's not perfect. But it's hers. She starts with the sheet, tugging gently at the corners, then pulls the quilt up with practiced ease. The pillows get a soft fluff one by one, and sometimes, if her arthritis isn't too loud that morning, she'll spritz a little lavender mist onto the linens. The window nearby filters in morning sun, laying soft stripes of gold across her comforter, and for a brief moment she breathes in that stillness before the world wakes up. To some, making the bed might seem like a small thing. Forgettable, even, but Margaret knows better. It's her way of telling herself, you're not invisible, you matter, this space is yours. There were years when she didn't make it. Back when the kids were little and mornings were messy, or during those seasons when life felt heavier than usual. But now, in this slower chapter, she's found peace in beginning with presence, not out of duty but dignity. She doesn't iron the sheets, she doesn't align the pillows like a hotel. She simply gives them a gentle pat, runs her hands over the fabric like she's tucking in a memory. It's not about how it looks, it's about how it makes her feel. And that's the secret organized women like Margaret have always known. It's never about the bed, it's about the message it sends. Today has begun, I am here, I am grounded. Once the bed is made, Margaret pads into the kitchen and pours her first cup of tea. She sits by the window in her favorite chair, the one with the faded floral cushion, and watches the birds dance in the trees. It's her 5-minute reward, a moment of calm she's earned just for showing up for herself. And yet, even with something so gentle, so quiet, many women skip it. They tell themselves it's just a bed, or no one's going to see it. But Margaret would tell you that's exactly why you should make it, not for anyone else. Not for appearance, but for that one part of you that's tired of waking up into chaos, that small part that longs for just a little order, a little control, a soft place to land. She remembers a time after her husband passed when everything felt out of sync. The house was too quiet, her days too long, but making the bed was the first thing she could still do with purpose. It didn't fix the grief, but it gave her a thread to hold onto, and sometimes all we need is one thread. So now she rises with the sun and reaches for it again. Because starting the day with that one simple act reminds her she's still here, still creating, still choosing calm over clutter. It's her anchor, and maybe, just maybe, it could be yours too. What's the first thing you do for yourself each morning? Not for the house, not for others, just for you, because while the bedroom may be where your day begins, the heart of your home is waiting too, and it deserves the same kind of care. After she finishes her tea and watches the morning light slip across the yard, Margaret always walks into the kitchen. It's quiet there, with only the ticking clock and the soft hum of the fridge. The bed is made, her day has begun, but now comes the part that used to make her sigh: the kitchen sink. There was a time when Margaret dreaded it. She'd walk past it with blind eyes, pretending not to notice the dishes stacking up like a to-do list no one had written. Sometimes she'd let them sit until the next morning, the dried coffee, rings and forks with crumbs reminding her of all the little things she hadn't done. It wasn't about laziness, it was about something heavier. When the house felt too full of memories and too empty of people, even rinsing a cup could feel like too much. But then something shifted, not all at once but slowly, after a conversation with an old friend. They were sitting at a church potluck, paper plates in hand, and her friend said something simple that stayed with her. You know, I like to think of my sink as a smile. If I keep it clean, the whole house seems to feel better. Margaret laughed then, but when she got home that evening, she looked at her own sink differently. She started small, no scrubbing marathons, just a gentle habit, a 3-minute reset after meals. A quick rinse, a quiet wipe, stacking the dishes instead of leaving them scattered. She even placed a lemon-scented towel nearby, not because it was fancy, but because the smell reminded her of her mother's kitchen. That scent alone made the act feel like care, not duty. Now, every time she finishes her toast or her simple lunch of soup and crackers, she walks over and tends to the sink like she's straightening the collar of a loved one. She doesn't rush, she doesn't aim for perfection, just a cloth, a little spray, and a moment of breath. Some days she talks to herself while doing it, not out loud but in that quiet way we all do, "You're doing fine, this is enough." Over time, something unexpected happened. Her kitchen began to feel lighter, not just cleaner but warmer, more alive. She noticed she wanted to cook more often. She played her favorite old songs while slicing fruit. She stood longer at the window while waiting for the kettle to boil, leaning on the counter that used to overwhelm her. It wasn't just about dishes. It was about being in a space that said, "You're cared for, this home is tended to. You are safe here." That's the truth about caring for the sink. It's not housework, it's heartwork. It's not about what others see when they visit. It's about what you feel when you walk in alone and see the shine even just a little. That shine is not about being spotless, it's about being soft with yourself, steady, present. Margaret eventually created what she calls her reset tray. A simple basket that sits beside the sink with her soft towel, a sponge, and a spray bottle she filled with water and a drop of lavender oil. It's not complicated, but it's beautiful. It waits for her each day like a quiet friend who knows just what she needs. Maybe today your sink looks tired, maybe you've walked past it too many times, that's okay. You don't have to tackle it all, just take a cloth, rinse a cup, and remind yourself this one small thing is enough for now, because the kitchen isn't just where we cook, it's where we remember, where we feed others and ourselves. Where laughter once echoed or where silence now settles. And sometimes all it takes is wiping down that one little space to feel the weight of the day lift just a little. So let me ask you, what's one small corner of your kitchen that makes you feel better when it's clean? The sink, the stovetop, maybe just the spot where your coffee cup sits. Whatever it is, let's start there. Because now it's time to look at what clutter really is, not the big messes, but the tiny moments we delay, one forgotten habit at a time. It's not always the clutter in the corners that drains us, it's the things we meant to finish but didn't. Margaret once noticed this in the most ordinary way, a jacket she tossed over the dining room chair. It was a cool afternoon. She came home tired, arms full, and meant to hang it up later, but later never came. Days passed, and each time she walked by, that jacket gave her a quiet nudge, a whisper that said, "You still haven't dealt with this." It wasn't just about the coat. It became a small symbol of something larger, the growing pile of unfinished moments that slowly hum beneath our awareness. A dish left out, a magazine on the couch, a letter half opened on the counter. These things don't scream for attention, but they speak in their own way, and together they weigh more than we realize. That's the thing about delayed action. It doesn't just take up space on the chair, it takes up space in the mind. One item becomes three, three becomes five. Soon we're surrounded by incomplete loops and we carry them quietly. Margaret started noticing this invisible heaviness. It wasn't just physical clutter, it was emotional weight. So she made a small change, something she now calls the 1-minute pause. Before walking away from anything, she asks herself, "Can I finish this loop now?" If the answer is yes, and it often is, she does. She hangs the jacket. She folds the blanket after resting on the couch. She returns the scissors to the drawer. She caps the pen and puts it back in the jar. These aren't chores, they're closures. She realized that these little tasks rarely take more than a minute, but the feeling afterward lasts much longer. A clear chair, a tidy table, an empty sink, they don't just look better, they feel better. They free up quiet space inside her, space to think, space to breathe. There was a time when Margaret prided herself on multitasking. Cooking while checking the mail, talking on the phone while watering plants. But over time, she found herself forgetting things, feeling rushed, misplacing notes. It wasn't age, it was clutter of the mind. Doing 3 things at once but completing none. Now she practices presence. One task, one loop at a time, that's the heart of it. Not speed, not perfection, just completion. It gives her peace in the moment and permission to rest without guilt. She doesn't always get it right. There are days when she still leaves her teacup on the side table or the newspaper opened halfway on the recliner, but now she notices. And noticing is the first step. When you begin to see the pattern, you can start to shift it, gently, without shame. So today, maybe just choose one loop to close, one item to return, one pile to smooth. It doesn't have to be the whole house. It just has to be one thing that tells your brain, we're not falling behind, we're right here, taking care of now. Because the energy you spend thinking about what you didn't finish is often greater than the energy it takes to just do it. And in a season of life when energy is precious, every reclaimed breath matters. What is one unfinished thing you could complete today in under a minute? A lid to twist back on, a drawer to shut, a dish to rinse. Let it be small. Let it be doable. Let it remind you that you are still in charge of your space and your peace. Because clutter isn't always measured in mess. Sometimes it shows up in what we keep seeing but haven't yet resolved. And sometimes the things we see too often are the ones stealing the most calm. But not all clutter looks like mess. Some of it looks like too much. Sometimes the calm we're chasing isn't about finishing a task, it's about removing what tugs at our attention in the first place. Margaret discovered this one quiet afternoon when she sat down in her living room to rest. The day had been light, a short walk, a few dishes, a phone call with her daughter. But when she sat in her favorite chair and looked around, something didn't feel restful. Her body was still, but her mind was. It darted from the pile of magazines to the half-melted candle, from the unopened mail to the collection of knickknacks on the mantel. There wasn't a mess, but there was too much. That's when she realized her eyes needed rest just as much as her feet did. She didn't do anything drastic. She started with the side table. For years, it had been a drop zone: coasters, remotes, church bulletins, bookmarks, half-finished crossword puzzles. None of it terrible, just too much. So she cleared it completely and stood back. The empty surface felt strange at first, even bare. But then she added back 3 things: a framed photo of her wedding day, a small lavender candle, and her favorite book of poems. That was it. The difference was immediate. The space felt open, her eyes had somewhere to rest and somewhere to return. It wasn't just about looking nice. It was about feeling lighter in the moment. She called it her "I pause." That little corner now brought her peace, not distraction. Over time, Margaret brought this habit into other rooms: the bathroom counter, the top of her dresser, even the kitchen windowsill. In each space, she asked herself the same question: does this need to be here? If the answer wasn't a clear yes, she let it go. One thing she learned quickly was this: it's not about organizing everything. That's a trap many fall into. We move the clutter, stack it, tuck it into bins. But if we're still seeing too much, we're still carrying it, just in a different way. True peace doesn't come from hiding things, it comes from choosing what not to keep out in the first place. She started using a simple trick she now swears by: the tray test. She'd take a small tray no bigger than a dinner plate and try to fit her favorite items on it. If it didn't all fit, something had to go. That way, each item had space to breathe, and in return, so did she. This wasn't about minimalism or creating a picture-perfect home. It was about making space for meaning. A single photo of her late husband, lovingly dusted each week, carried far more weight than a dozen knickknacks. A candle she actually lit brought more warmth than a decorative jar she never touched. Her goal wasn't empty surfaces. It was surfaces that spoke gently and clearly: you are home, you are held, you are not overwhelmed. And perhaps the most surprising part, she found herself lingering more, sitting longer, breathing slower. Even her evening reading time felt richer, more grounded, because her space no longer shouted for her attention. So now she asks you, what object in your home truly deserves its spotlight? What one thing, when seen, brings you comfort or joy or memory? Maybe it's your mother's Bible. Maybe it's the mug your grandchild painted. Maybe it's just a flower you picked on your morning walk. Whatever it is, let it stand on its own. Let it shine, because when we curate what we see, we curate how we feel. And as the day draws closer to its end, there's one more habit Margaret treasures: a small ritual that doesn't take much time but quietly closes each day with care. Just as a few chosen objects can soften the way we move through our homes by day, there's a quiet magic in how we close the evening. Margaret often says that the way she ends her day determines how she meets the next one. For her, it's not about cleaning the whole house before bed or making things look perfect. It's about something far simpler, far kinder. She calls it her gentle goodnight. Every evening, usually around 8:30, she begins her small ritual. The television is turned off. The kitchen grows quiet. She moves slowly, not in a rush but with rhythm, as if tucking in a child. She dims the lamps in the living room, folding the throw blanket that warmed her knees. She smooths the cushion she leaned on and picks up her teacup from the table. One last rinse under warm water. No fuss, no noise. Just soft water and a deep breath. Then she walks through the hallway, checking that the doors are locked, the lights gently lowered. Her hands know what to do without thinking, but her heart is always aware. These are not chores, they are little gestures of gratitude. A way of saying to the house, "Thank you for holding me today." She always ends in the kitchen. That's where the day started, and that's where it quietly rests. With one press of a switch, the overhead light clicks off. The counters glow faintly under the moonlight through the window, and as she turns to go, Margaret whispers softly, "Thank you." She's not sure when she started saying it out loud. Maybe it began during the lonely years after her husband passed. Maybe it was a habit born from grief, from needing to feel held when no one else was there. But now it's a prayer, a closing. A way to release the weight of the day, no matter how heavy or light it's been. One evening, her granddaughter asked her why she always said thank you to an empty room. Margaret just smiled and said, "Because even a house deserves to hear it's done a good job." That answer stayed with the child, who now, as a grown woman, keeps her own version of the ritual. To help herself ease into rest, Margaret also created what she calls her night basket. It's a small woven tray on her nightstand. Inside it, there's hand cream she uses on her fingers, which ache more than they used to, a lavender candle already half burned. A small journal where she sometimes scribbles just one sentence from the day, not a whole entry, just a word, a moment, a reminder. Some nights she writes, "Quiet porch," or "Rain on the roof," or simply, "I'm still here." This basket isn't fancy, but it centers her. It's her way of telling herself that sleep is not the end of the day, it's the soft landing she's made space for, and she protects it like she would protect a child's nap, with quiet, with care. That's what this habit is truly about, not productivity, not checking things off a list, but closing the day with intention, folding away the noise, making space for rest. It's not always easy. There are nights when she forgets. Nights when the blanket stays on the floor or the cup in the sink, but even then she speaks to herself with gentleness, because the habit isn't about performance, it's about peace. So tonight, ask yourself gently, what's one thing you could do to end the day more kindly? Could you straighten the tablecloth, turn on soft music while you wash one last dish, light a candle even for just 5 minutes? Whatever it is, let it be small. Let it be yours, because how your home says goodnight to you becomes how your heart prepares for rest. And now, as the house quiets, Margaret has 2 more habits to share, small treasures that aren't about cleaning at all, but about the soul of the home itself. Long after the lights are dimmed and the cup is rinsed, there's still one place in Margaret's home that waits quietly for her. It isn't a large room or a grand piece of furniture. In fact, it's just a small corner in her bedroom by the window, but it holds something no other part of the house does, a sense of return, a gentle reset, her own little corner of calm. Margaret created this space during a difficult season right after she lost a dear friend. She felt untethered, like the days kept moving, but her heart was still trying to catch up. One evening, without much planning, she cleared off the small table next to her reading chair. She placed a photo of her and her friend from years ago, both smiling wide beneath a summer sky. Beside it, she laid a shell they had found together on the beach in Maine, and from the kitchen shelf she brought her grandmother's old teacup, cracked but still lovely. She didn't call it anything at first. But over time, she began to think of it as her reset corner. Now it's part of her rhythm. She visits it in the morning, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with quiet. At night, she sits nearby and just breathes, no phone, no plans. Just presence. This corner doesn't entertain or demand, it simply gives, and in return she gives it her attention, brief but full. The rule for this space is simple: only keep what brings warmth, nothing practical, nothing that nags. Just things that hold memory, meaning, or peace. A handwritten note from her grandson, a pressed flower from her garden, a tiny cross she held during Sunday services for years. Each item has been chosen. Not for decoration, but for comfort. And she's learned it doesn't take much. 1 or 2 items are enough. In fact, less is better. When objects have space around them, their meaning grows, and so does the calm they bring. Margaret also keeps a small card there, nothing fancy, just a note with her favorite scripture, "Be still and know that I am God." On harder mornings, she reads it aloud. On gentler days, she just glances at it and feels steadier. Some days, she adds a short prayer or a quote she's torn from an old magazine, little pieces of stillness tucked in plain sight. If you were to visit, you might walk past that corner without noticing it. But for Margaret, it's one of the most sacred places in her home. It doesn't solve her problems, it doesn't erase sadness. But it offers her a place to land, a place to remember who she is beyond the noise. Maybe you've never thought of creating such a space, or maybe you already have one without naming it. A certain chair by the window. A spot near your bookshelf, a porch swing that holds the stories of your summer evenings. The truth is, these spaces don't need titles or labels, they just need your permission to matter. So what's one item in your home that always brings you peace? A photograph, a stone from a walk you once took, a bookmark with your mother's handwriting? What if you placed it where you could see it each day, not to admire but to feel? Because our homes aren't just places we live in, they're places that can speak to us, comfort us, remind us, and just like us, they breathe, they hold stories, they wait to be touched again. Now, as we listen to the quiet of that little corner, let's remember that the air we breathe inside our homes matters too. And sometimes, what our hearts need most is simply to let it in. Just as the quiet corner holds our stillness, there's another kind of peace that moves and asks us to open to it. Margaret discovered this not through a grand gesture but through one small window in her kitchen. It started one spring morning. The sky was pale and clear and the light spilled softly across the sink. She reached for her coffee as usual, then paused. The room felt heavy. Not messy, not loud, just still in a way that made her chest feel tight. So she walked over and slid the window open. The breeze that entered wasn't strong. It barely stirred the edge of the curtain, but it changed everything. It carried the smell of damp earth and something floral she couldn't name. The leaves outside shifted gently, and somewhere beyond the fence, a bird sang a single clear note. Margaret stood there for longer than usual, one hand around her warm mug, the other resting on the sill. She hadn't planned it, but her whole body seemed to breathe deeper. The house felt lighter. So did she. Since then, opening that window has become part of her rhythm, not every hour, not even every day. But when the air feels stale or her mood feels stuck, that little window becomes a doorway to movement, to softness, to something that feels like hope. We often think of fresh air as something for spring cleaning or summer afternoons. But it's more than that. It's a reset. It clears more than dust. It clears the weight we don't always realize we're carrying. The quiet tension that builds between laundry and news headlines, between quiet rooms and unanswered questions. Margaret now calls that window her renewal point. One place in her home where she invites life to enter again. It's not about drafts or temperature, it's about energy. She's even hung a small wind chime just outside it, a gift from her sister. It doesn't ring loudly, just a soft tinkle when the breeze is right, like the house whispering back, "Yes, I'm still here too." You don't need to open every window, just one, maybe the one in your kitchen where you make tea, or the one near your favorite chair where the morning sun touches your lap. Let the curtain lift slightly. Let the scent of the world drift in, even if only for a moment. You might catch the smell of pine, or rain, or freshly cut grass from a neighbor's yard. You might hear birds or the hum of traffic softened by distance. These tiny sensory moments don't fix everything, but they reconnect you to now, to breath, to life beyond the walls. Some days Margaret places a chair near her window and just sits. No book, no radio. Just her, the breeze, and the rhythm of the world moving around her. She says it reminds her she's part of something larger, something still in motion, even when her own life feels slower than it once did. If you'd like to try this, start small. Choose one window, wipe the sill, pull the curtain back. Maybe place a small plant or a scented sachet nearby, something to mark it as special. Then open it for 5 minutes, just 5. See how your home responds, see how your chest softens, how your thoughts settle. You might be surprised, and if it helps, add something gentle nearby. A lightweight curtain that dances with the air, a favorite chair that invites you to pause. A little reminder that your home breathes and so do you. What does the morning smell like in your home, and what would it feel like to welcome in something new, even just a breeze? Because these habits, as simple as they seem, aren't about chores, they're about coming home to yourself. And as we near the end of this journey, it's time to look back to remember why these moments matter and how a clean space can become something far deeper. A sanctuary. As the breeze settles and the curtain stills, what lingers is not just the freshness in the room, but a deeper quiet. And in that quiet, Margaret often reminds herself of something it took her decades to learn. A peaceful home has nothing to do with perfection. There was a time not so long ago when she tried to do it all. The house had to shine, meals had to be hot and homemade, the laundry folded just so. Birthdays were themed, holidays color-coded, even the junk drawer had categories. She took pride in it, but underneath she was tired, not just in her body but in her spirit. The joy she once felt in caring for her home had turned into pressure. She was doing everything but not everything with love. Now, years later, the pace has softened. Her standards have changed, not because she's given up, but because she's grown wiser. These days, she picks one habit and does it with full attention, making the bed in the morning, wiping the counter after lunch, lighting a candle before dinner. That's enough. Some days the mail piles up, some days the shelf stays dusty. And when it does, she quietly tells herself, it's not that you're falling behind, it's just time to rest. She's traded the chase for perfection with something much gentler, presence. That shift didn't happen overnight. There were days when she still heard the old voices, you should be doing more, it's not enough. But little by little, she learned to answer them with kindness, to remind herself that this season of life isn't about checking every box. It's about noticing, choosing, resting in what matters most. She thinks of her granddaughter who visits on Sundays and always comments how peaceful grandma's house feels, not clean, not perfect, just peaceful. That's the word that stays. Margaret hopes long after she's gone, that's what will remain, not the sparkling floor, not the perfectly labeled pantry, but the way the house felt. Gentle, welcoming, steady, that's the real gift of these habits. They're not chores, they're not rules, they're quiet invitations to return to yourself, to create a rhythm that matches your heart, not the expectations of others, and even just one done with care can shift the entire energy of a day. You don't have to do them all, in fact, you're not meant to. Some weeks, Margaret forgets to open the window, other times, the corner of calm goes untouched, but she always comes back, that's the grace of it. These habits aren't about performance, they're about returning, gently, whenever you're ready. So today, take a breath and ask yourself, not what should I do, but what feels kind right now. What's one habit that speaks to the rhythm of your home? Maybe it's folding a blanket, maybe it's sitting by a window, maybe it's saying thank you to the quiet as you turn out the light. There's no checklist, no gold star, just one simple truth. You deserve a home that meets you with peace, not pressure. And in living this way, you give something lasting not only to yourself but to those around you. You teach your children, your grandchildren, that a calm space is a choice. That beauty is in the doing, not just the outcome. That love shows up in small ways every single day. So which habit feels doable for you today? Which one could you begin, not as a task but as a gift? Let's take a breath now. And reflect. As we take this final breath together, let's gently step back and look at what's shifted, not just in our homes but in our hearts. What began with small habits has become something much deeper. Margaret's journey wasn't about scrubbing harder or staying busier. It was about letting go of the chase and leaning into peace. One made bed, one clean sink, one open window. These weren't tasks, they were acts of love. Over time, they turned her days from scattered to steady, from burdened to beautifully rooted. She used to feel overwhelmed. Now she feels held, not because the house is spotless, but because it speaks kindly to her. It reflects care, not perfection, and in that care, something quiet and powerful has grown, a sanctuary, one she created with her own two hands and her full heart. That's the real invitation here. This isn't about cleaning more. It's about loving better, about choosing softness over pressure. And understanding that your home is not just where you live, it's where you return to yourself. It's how you remind your soul you matter, you are enough. So if even one of these habits touched something in you today, if it made you breathe deeper or smile gently, go ahead and like this video. And I'd love to hear in the comments, which habit will you begin this week? Or do you already have a quiet rhythm of your own? Share it. Someone else might need it too. And if you'd like more gentle resets, more soft ways to reclaim your space and your spirit, feel free to subscribe. We're building something tender here, a quiet corner on the internet where peace is allowed to grow. Maybe today all you need is to wipe the counter, open a window, and whisper, "This is for me." That's enough. So tell me, what does peace look like for you, and how will you begin to welcome it home?